Dr. Young is in the Communication Studies program here at USI. So she is an associate professor in Communication Studies and director of the basic course at the University of Southern Indiana. Her research lies at the intersection of rhetorical studies and queer feminist scholarship, focusing on how cultural texts discursively construct race, gender, and sexuality. She has published in a number of scholarly journals, including the Journal of International Intercultural Communication, Sexuality and Culture, QED, a journal of GLBTQ worldmaking, and Women in Language. She is a contributor to several edited volumes, including Queer Communication Pedagogy and Locating Queerness in the Media. She is the co-author of the book Pursuing Popular Culture, Methods for Researching the Everyday. And in her spare time, Dr. Young enjoys cooking, running, kayaking, and swimming, as well as spending time with her 4 cats, McLovin, Sunshine, Kit Kat, and Waldo. Those are great names. Okay. All right, so I am going to turn this over to Dr. Young.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lin. Can everyone hear me? Hopefully so. I really appreciate the opportunity here to talk a little bit about my research and get a chance to hear from all of you after my presentation, because I think one of the great things about pop culture is that we can all find something of interest. And so my talk for today is Somewhere Over the Rainbow, Exploring Queer Pop Culture. And so, oops, let's see if that works here. Click. Just a little introduction before we get started. I wanted to first define some terms. Again, I usually teach a lot of courses here that address queer media, but I wanted to make sure that for folks who maybe this is the first time even hearing the term queer, to get a chance to define some of those basic terms before I jump into some of the analysis. And then I'm going to switch over and look at some of these major tropes that we see in television and film related to LGBTQ identities. I'm then going to talk about a little bit more about what representation means in the rise of queer-centric television. And then I'm going to really showcase 2 of my case studies that I've done. So 2 research projects I've done and completed in the past. One is on the television series The Fosters, and the other is on the series Sense8. And then I'll wrap things up with talking a little bit about the future of queer pop culture and where we can go from here. So just a glossary of terms. Again, these are not all-encompassing, but I thought that it'd be important that when I use these terms that folks know sort of what I mean. And so when I refer to gender identity, for example, I'm referring to a person's sense of their gender, so how you self-identify. So that may be, are you a man, are you a woman, are you intersexed, are you gender fluid, are you somewhere in between? But again, that is how the person self-identifies in terms of their gender, and that's different from sex, or what we refer to as biological sex, or what you are born with, okay? Additionally, when I use the term transgender, I use this as an umbrella term for people who have a gender identity or their gender expression differs from what typically is associated with their sex assigned at birth. And so, for example, when I say transgender persons or transgender women or transgender men, right, again, this is an umbrella term in which gender identity or gender expression is different from what's associated with one's sex. So I don't have it up here, but for example, the term cisgender refers to someone whose gender identity or gender expression is typically associated with the sex that they're assigned at birth. Additionally, I like to use the term Latinx, which is a much more gender inclusive term. In terms of Latino, Latina, I use Latinx, and that refers to people whose ancestry is of Mexico, Central America, South America, and the Caribbean living in the United States. And then let's see what else here. You may not be familiar with the acronym, and the acronym continues to grow because we have such a wide diversity and spectrum of gender identities and sexual orientations. And so the acronym I like to use is LGBTQ+, and that stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, pansexual, asexual, intersex, questioning, gender variant, and everything in between, okay? And I'm sure if you have questions about the acronym, please feel free to ask them at the end of my lecture here. But again, this is sort of an umbrella term. But really sort of the term in my lecture here is the term queer. And so I like to use this instead of having the mouthful of the acronym to refer to, again, gender or sexual minority identities. It sort of is the overall umbrella that sort of encompasses that. In many ways, we may have heard this term in the past as something derogatory. Has been used in many ways in the past as something that's seen as negative, as a stigmatized identity. And in many ways, queer is now embraced by academics and activists, and I think even the younger generation here, as something that is a positive thing. So again, it sort of often stands in for the LGBTQ plus acronym, using queer. Also, when we talk about queer, okay, we're usually talking about this idea of identities, but also we can think of queer as a verb. And so when one is queering, instead of thinking about just an identity, thinking about how as a verb, it's a way of disrupting or rethinking, resisting gender and sexual norms, oftentimes associated with heteronormativity. It's also used in many ways to interrogate the language that we use and how we talk and think and make sense of discourses associated with what is deviant or what is seen as perverse, the taboo, stigmatized identities, sometimes the grotesque, anything that is non-normative. We can also use queer as a verb to sort of resist and rethink how we think about some of these categories. And so sometimes I'll be using queer as a queer identity, and other times I'll be using queer as queering as a verb to sort of rethink or see it as how do we reconstruct possibilities associated not just with LGBTQ plus identities, but thinking about some of the things we talk about and these discourses surrounding things like, again, the stigmatized taboo-ness of society. So there's a lot of pop culture out there, and we could cover a whole bunch of wide variety, right? We can talk about television, we can talk about film, we can talk about advertisements, we can talk about literature, we can talk about comic books and video games, celebrity culture. We can have a huge amount of time talking about queer pop culture. And so my area of expertise, I primarily focus on television and film. So while you could take whole courses just on like queer literature, right? Or, queering, video games. I want to just say that like, I acknowledge that there's a whole world of queer pop culture out there, but I'm primarily going to focus on television and film. And just a few images here. For those gamers out there, I think about how video gaming can be an opportunity for us to embody different queer identities. And so, yes, I do play some video games. And one of my favorite is Assassin's Creed Odyssey. And so you can choose to be one character or another, a man or a woman. And I chose Cassandra. And what's wonderful is in that type of interactive world, you can make choices about engaging in different relationships. And so for me, Cassandra can be a bisexual character in this video game, or she can be a queer character, right? So thinking about how video games can be an opportunity for us to explore different gender identities and sexual orientations. We also see, for example, I was thinking about an animated series. Some of you may have heard of recently, I know that the reboot of She-Ra was really, really big and looking at queer representation. One of my favorite series, a little more adult in terms of the animated series, but Harley Quinn and her relationship with Poison Ivy in the animated series. And so we can see, again, queer representation in all different types of mediums when it comes to pop culture. But primarily, I'm going to focus on television and film. So what I wanted to do was spend a little time talking about some variety of tropes, or what's known as literary devices, in television and film. And so what we see is that historically, in many ways, there are particular sort of stereotypes that are used over and over again in media when we look at queer characters. And so I wanted to address some of these and think about what are the things that we continue to see in pop culture, and what are things that are perhaps being addressed or being countered or resisted, okay? And so one trope that we see when it comes to queer characters in television and film is what's known as the villain. Okay, so oftentimes queer characters are seen as predatory, as scheming, as pathological, as dangerous, as evil. Vito Russo's The Celluloid Closet, by the way, is an amazing book, and also was turned into a documentary that addresses some of these tropes in film and looks at the history of film and how these are used time and time again. And so some of the things to think about is, you know, people talk about, you know, looking at these different sort of villains, and you can see it from, you know, dramas and television and film to even animated Disney films. And so, for example, Silence of the Lambs, right? The sort of psychopath ends up being a transvestite Jonathan Demme who wants to murder women and wear their skin for clothing, right? And so he's reinforcing the villain, the sort of predatory, dangerous, pathological, right, somehow mentally ill villain. You have Downton Abbey's Thomas Barrow, and I actually wrote about this in my analysis, where Thomas, right, is an employee of Downton Abbey, and time again, he's seen as sort of scheming, as backstabbing, as not seen as a responsible character, not to be trusted. And so again, that's even in, right, you know, in contemporary representations, we see that. I even say that, you know, like characters like the Ursula on The Little Mermaid. I joke that a lot of my classes, I ruin Disney films for students. But one of the things is thinking about how, in many ways, she is visually marked as a non-feminine, right, sort of perhaps lesbian character, and therefore she's then reinforcing sort of the villain. I don't know if you've ever seen The Little Mermaid, right? But Ursula is the sea witch who wants to steal the Little Mermaid's voice and ultimately like capture her and sort of rule the sea world, okay? But again, here again, you end up having the trope of the villain over and over again. And so queer characters are not to be trusted, they're dangerous, they're predatory, they're in fact the villain, and we don't usually see heroes, right? The opposite of villain are heroes when it comes to these stereotypical tropes. Another trope we see over and over again in media is the victim. And so we see storylines and characters in which often gay and trans characters are pitied, are miserable. They're often a tragic figure. They're often the victim of violent murders. There's usually what I call the unhappily ever after. So in many storylines, you might have a gay couple, right? And I don't want to joke or belittle, but oftentimes you end up having, for a brief minute, the gay couple is happy, and then one of them ends up having an untimely death. And so you end up never having really sort of, there's always these sort of tragic storylines associated with gay romantic couples. You end up having characters such as Tom Hanks plays Andy Beckett in the film Philadelphia, in which he's a character that contracts HIV/AIDS because he's gay and right, is slowly dying and tries to sort of have a lawsuit against his employers. And so you end up having sort of, again, he's sort of a tragic figure. Back in the day, the big movie was Brokeback Mountain. I don't know, I feel like some of you younger folks out there might not remember this film, but it was, right, the gay cowboy film. And not to ruin it for you, but Jack Twist, one of the characters, is brutally murdered. And so again, these are just a few examples, but we see this over and over again, that you end up having gay characters or trans characters, queer characters who are somehow the sad character, the tragic character, oftentimes murdered or suicidal. And so we're supposed to sort of sympathize for them, but not necessarily empathize with them. Okay. A few more. One is the sissy. And that is something that Vito Russo talks about in his work. The sissy is sort of the caricature of gay men. And so we see this as sort of over the top, flamboyant, effeminate. They're often right into fashion. They're well groomed. We see this in a number of series. I think of like Sex and the City, in the film The Birdcage. You know, probably for some of you might know Jack McFarlane from Will and Grace. And so they're often used as sort of over the top, again, caricatures, they're used for comic relief, and they're also known as camp gay because they're so over the top. They're again seen as funny, so we don't really ever take them seriously. And in fact, in some ways, it doesn't humanize, but rather ends up having gay men be seen as this one particular type. And so we don't see a diversity of representation here. Rather, it reinforces sort of the flamboyant gay. And this is the sissy is a trope that's been used throughout film. Like if you look at the history of film in terms of the 1920s and 30s, the sissy is used again to provide comic relief, and as Russo writes here, made everyone feel more manly or more womanly by occupying the space in between. And so that character never actually perhaps has their sexual orientation or sexual identity specifically marked, but because of their performance of them, right, having these particular effeminate stereotypical characteristics, we then interpret them as, right, the sissy or the gay character on the series or film. And then the last one that kind of extends sometimes to the sissy, there's sort of an overlap here, is the gay best friend. And so we see this trope time and time again in a number of film and television, where it's usually like the platonic best friend to the straight woman, where they're just sort of the ideal, except the one thing is that they're gay, right? So sometimes they're right, they have sort of, they're emotionally sensitive, they're fashionable, sometimes they're used for comic relief. I remember when I was, gosh, this dates me, when I remember watching My Best Friend's Wedding, and George Downs, right, is one of her besties and pretends to be straight when she ends up going to her other best friend's wedding to try to win him back. And so again, in many ways, we see some of this in film and television. Probably some of you may have heard of Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt, and Titus Andromedon kind of isn't so much the ideal platonic friend as he is the gay best friend, but in many ways, he continues to reinforce sort of that comic relief, even though he might be a bit more three-dimensional as a character. He's kind of over the top, he's still a bit flamboyant, but again, he's supposed to somehow emotionally support the main character on the series, which is Kimmy. Okay, so again, we see this time and time again of sort of the gay best friend. And this is not to say that it's a negative stereotype. It's just that we see sort of these sort of tropes over and over again, that they're really sort of ends up reducing the characters into sort of one-dimensional sort of spaces, rather than seeing them as three-dimensional characters in film and television. Okay. So what do we see? Well, for many of us who watch TV, we can see that there actually has been increased representation of LGBTQ characters in television. One question I was asked recently was, when do you remember the first like queer character that you saw on television? Or can you think of, right, the first sort of character that you saw as a gay character or bisexual character or lesbian or trans? And what's funny is that I don't remember, right? I can't think of a time when I didn't, but I would have to say that some of the sort of stories that I remember were the first time perhaps might have been with, Dawson's Creek, right, where you end up having a gay character. I know Will and Grace was really popular at the time when I was sort of growing up. And so what we've seen is that there actually has been, since the 90s, increased representation and visibility of LGBTQ characters in television. And what this really means in many ways is that we're seeing more visibility, and in that way creates sort of a normalizing effect. That is, it doesn't become just the token gay best friend. It's that we end up seeing them as just of many different characters in television. We're also seeing increased racial diversity of LGBTQ characters on television. And so traditionally, what we've seen are often sort of gay white men have been sort of the norm if we're talking about gay characters on TV and film. And what we're seeing now is an increase of racial diversity of queer characters. And so, for example, in 2021, GLAAD reported that approximately 9% of broadcast scripted primetime shows, including these streaming platforms, we we call TV, right? Hulu, Netflix, Amazon. We're seeing about 9% actually have queer characters or storylines in these series, but we're seeing also increased racial diversity. And just a few pictures on the side here, I was thinking of, for example, if you watch Grey's Anatomy, if you watch or have watched Glee, Modern Family, one of my favorites is True Blood. And so in a wide variety, from sort of sitcoms to dramas to sci-fi fantasy, we're seeing sort of more and more, a diversity of queer characters. And I think that's important because in many ways it's saying, right, that we can sort of recognize the sort of normalization, right? That these are just many sort of characters in the character world on television. Okay. Also thinking about, makeover reality television. So it's not just fictional characters, but also having, reality television can play a real great role in thinking about seeing real people. And so again, there's so much television out there, but one of my favorites is Queer Eye. And one of the great things about, I think, Queer Eye is that the Fab Five, right, go and help people. And when I say makeovers, right, even the sort of signage here says Queer Eye, more than a makeover, right? That you end up having these 5 individuals come in and help people who transform their lives. And you often end up having them, this might be the first time that a person is interacting with someone who's identifies as queer or gay. And so what's wonderful about this series in many ways is that these makeovers, again, allow us to sort of humanize queer individuals and in real settings and situations. There's also been several episodes of Queer Eye where you end up having the person who's getting a makeover, right, is a minority, may it be racial minority, sexual or gender identity, right? And so in many ways that also humanized. When we see more of these real representations in terms of reality television, that can also be an opportunity for audiences who may not perhaps, right, click over to particular queer-centric TV shows, but this might be the first opportunity for folks to really sort of humanize individuals. So there's one thing to have including queer characters in television. There's a whole other thing of having and constructing television for queer audiences. And so just a few to think about, because again, there's a wide variety, is thinking about queer-centric television. And so again, I reached to when my experiences, the L Word first came out in 2004 and ran until 2009. And this was the first series in which it was sort of, again, fictional, but the lives of lesbian and bisexual women, like the cast, right, was of these women, these queer women in West Hollywood, California. And then recently there's been the reboot of the L Word, Generation Q. And even in the images, you can see a wide variety of representation. But the L Word in many ways, it was extremely significant in the early 2000s because it was the first time really that you end up having a cast that was of queer women. And so in many ways, this becomes the queer-centric television. And thinking about queer audiences, this is the first time you may end up seeing yourself in some of the characters. I would say that it was a fun series, don't get me wrong, but of course there's always limitations. I would call the L Word kind of a soap opera drama. You're also talking about West Hollywood, California, so not always in terms of a wide variety of representation and diversity associated with socioeconomic class, right? These are usually really very wealthy lesbians and bisexual and queer women. They're also very feminine. Many of them, most of them are extremely feminine. And so in some ways, perhaps not a true or authentic depiction of the diversity of queer women in society. But again, it was one of the first series that really resonated and is groundbreaking in terms of having an all cast of queer queer women as the center of these stories. A few other examples. One is RuPaul's Drag Race. If you haven't already heard of RuPaul, Google RuPaul. But a reality competition series. It's been airing since 2009. And in many ways, I think that Drag Race has helped a lot of folks who may have never heard of drag culture or drag queens to get a chance to be exposed to drag queen cultures. And so I wanted to show a clip real quick, a trailer from, I think, 2 seasons ago, but thinking about, again, how this series, right, this reality competition series is queer-centric, right? It really sort of highlights and celebrates drag queen culture.
And now, a message from the President of the United States.
My fellow Americans, the time has come for America's first drag queen president. Friday, February 28th, 13 new candidates enter the race. Hey, bitches! I'm here to slay the competition.
Sherry is a big, loud Broadway dame. We are the best queens in the world, but I'm the one to beat.
Serving our country with opulence.
I love this runway look. I became very excited.
It was some next level.
Liberating us with laughter. I'm gonna press the trapdoor button. And defending the U.S. of shade.
I love to give face. You do? That face ain't moving. Shady boo.
Our nation's biggest stars come out. Young Money in the house. It's Nicki Minaj.
I named myself Nikita after you.
Whoa, you are doing me proud.
Who down with AOC? Yeah, you know me. Tandy Newton, you made it.
I'm a little frightened, but fascinated.
The hilarious Leslie Jones. You look so beautiful. Are you ready for a season so groundbreaking?
Being gay is still punishable by death in Iran.
I'm so thankful that you're part of our country.
Thank you.
I think you are fabulous.
It will go down in history. Gentlemen, I have a surprise so big, you'll never see it coming.
You bitches aren't ready.
What are you waiting for? Join the revolution. Do it for your country.
I pledge allegiance.
I pledge allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the drag, to the drag, to the drag. I pledge allegiance to the drag.
RuPaul's Drag Race Season 12 premieres Friday, February 28th at 8.
It's not that drag queens and drag culture haven't been mainstream, but I think in many ways, RuPaul's Drag Race has exposed audience that may not know about drag queens and drag culture. And we even see sort of, I want to call it almost mainstreaming. We see even some of the language and the fashion associated with drag queens today. So for example, this idea of throwing shade is very clearly a language that is used in drag queen culture and performance. And so I think what's fascinating is that while you end up having what's considered traditionally a marginalized performance space and a queer sort of culture of drag queens and drag kings, by the way, then in fact that RuPaul's Drag Race has ultimately, again, exposed audience, a wide audience, and sort of mainstreamed drag race or drag queens into mainstream America. I would also say that it's fun, right? You see sort of the playfulness, the overtopness, you know, and you end up having these queens competing, right? And having makeup and clothing and performance, but you also saw some of the judges who are very clearly not drag queens, but we recognize them. And so it's really interesting to see how queer-centric television here with RuPaul's Drag Race has sort of become sort of mainstream. And then the last series that I was thinking about in thinking about queer-centric television, again, series that really focus on queer cultures, is Ryan Murphy's Pose. I don't know if you've ever seen or heard of Pose. I think there were 3 seasons, if I'm correct. But Pose looks at, rather than drag culture, what's known as ball culture in New York City during the 1980s and 90s. And so it centers on more a Black, Latinx, trans, queer, and gender nonconforming persons. And so again, what you have is a series that's not just having one token trans character or one token, you know, Black lesbian, but rather it's sharing stories and experiences and developing a whole cast of characters that focus on specifically ball culture. And so what we end up having then is recognizing, and we continue to see, not just these increasing queer characters in television, but also shows and series that are centering on specific queer cultures. So one thing I wanted to put a caveat to is that when we think of queer, again, we think of LGBTQ plus identities. But in many ways, I've mentioned how queering is a verb. And so queering sort of what I would say heterosexuality in media, this was something that happened maybe a year ago. I had one of my students actually send an email to me and say, have you seen this episode of House Hunters? And I went, no, tell me more. But House Hunters, you know, the sort of reality series where people try to find their, you know, perfect house, or maybe their vacation home or what have you, on HGTV, for the first time had a throuple. Okay, so it ended up having a couple who ended up having a third person, and so it was a throuple, as that's sort of the term here, but ended up having a throuple look for their forever home. And so it was interesting how the series, again, a reality show here, that ends up having sort of normalizing, right? That this is a throuple looking for a home, and they end up sharing, right, their romantic partnership. And in many ways, this isn't just about queering queer identities, but also here in some ways rethinking what it means in terms of heterosexuality, right? And so it sort of extends those bounds associated with heterosexuality traditionally being about monogamy, right? Two people, and here you end up having a threesome, sort of, right? Three people in this couple. So calling it a throuple. But I think that's interesting. If, you know, we may be seeing more of that in terms of how we queer heterosexuality in media as well. Okay. So let me take a breather here. There's a lot out there. And so I wanted to briefly touch on 2 case studies of my own queer pop culture research. You may find it interesting, you may not. But for me, I watch a lot of TV, and I joke about this, but I watch a lot of TV and I can't turn it off. When I'm watching television, I'm constantly thinking about these intersections of gender, sexuality, class, race, and just sort of, I can't turn it off. And so what I find is that I enjoy sort of critiquing, analyzing, and trying to understand what are the meanings being communicated, what are the messages being communicated in pop culture when we're talking about you know, queer identities. So specifically, one case study that I looked at was the TV series The Fosters. What's interesting about The Fosters, it was aired initially on Freeform, ABC Family, that became Freeform. And this show really focuses on a lesbian couple, and the last name is the Fosters, and they end up having a wide variety of sort of family formations. And so they adopted 2 individuals, 2 children. They have a biological son from a previous marriage. You end up fostering children as well. And so the Fosters, it's sort of a plan where it's not only their last name, but also the fact that they are fostering. But the series really is, you know, when you look at the audience, the Fosters really was sort of, I would say teen, preteen, sort of emerging adult sort of audience here, which is different from maybe sort of more of, you know, traditional adult shows. And so what you end up having is looking at what are the messages then being communicated to a younger audience, you know, maybe adolescent to preteen to teen here, associated with the Fosters. And specifically, I looked at, because you could analyze television in a number of ways, but I was really interested in the representation of Lena and Steph as both an interracial as well as a lesbian couple. And in many ways, the series over time, and there's been multiple seasons, but the series, in looking at the first few seasons, you see that it normalizes the lesbian couple. Right? They're just 2 moms trying to figure out how to be a family in these multiple ways. But what you find in the series is just how normal it is to see affection, physical intimacy. At one point, they're thinking about starting, you know, perhaps getting pregnant. And so there's one episode where even they're having what any perhaps married couple with kids might have, which is trying to figure out a time to end up having their own romantic sexual time together. And maybe it has to be in the car in the driveway because they just have so many kids and so many obligations. But what's interesting again is how it just ends up normalizing their sort of romantic and sexual intimacy in the series. And that's what's also important, is thinking about while we may end up having more representation of queer romantic partnerships, what we tend to find still is that sexual intimacy and, sort of, I won't say sex scenes, but having any type of sexual intimacy often is still considered taboo when we look at romantic relationships associated with same-sex couples. The other clip I wanted to show briefly, and I think we have time here, is when Lena talks to one of her foster sons about, again, sort of gender expression. And so he's being bullied at school associated with wearing nail polish. And so she tries to sort of talk to him about this. And ultimately, he's kind of confused as to, why he's being bullied and things like that. But I think here's a really sort of touching scene of mothering that I think is important here.
May I? Just a little dab will do the trick. Right? Okay. When Steph and I are at home, we hold hands and kiss. Really? Well, we used to do it a lot more often, but we've just been really busy lately. What does being busy have to do with holding hands? Okay, we're getting a little off track here. My point is, sometimes when we're out in a new neighborhood or we're walking home late to our car, we won't hold hands. Why? Some people out there are afraid of what's different. And sometimes they want to hurt people like Steph and me. So every time we're out and I want to hold Steph's hand, but I decide not to, I get mad. I'm mad at the people who might want to hurt us, but mad at myself too, for not standing up to them. Because the thing is, if you're taught to hide what makes you different, you end up feeling a lot of shame about who you are. And that's not okay. There is nothing wrong with you for wearing nail polish. Just like there's nothing wrong with me for holding Steph's hand. What's wrong is the people out there who make us feel unsafe.
On the one hand, we can say they're just a normal family. They're just like everyone else. And yet that scene mentions specifically a few unique stressors and things that that Steph and Lena face, as well as their foster son, right? And one is this idea of sometimes we're fearful of being out as a couple, right? We recognize that there's hate, that there's potential violence, that there's homophobia out there. And so we're just cautious of that. And yet it's not right. And so I think that's also important, that the series throughout the seasons do address some unique issues associated with same-sex couples, specifically with this lesbian couple, Steph and Lena. And also wonderful scene that reinforces to Jude, right, that there's nothing wrong. If he chooses to wear nail polish, then it's who he is, and that should be just fine. But to also, recognize that it's the problem is other people, not him. And so I think that's a really unique scene there that highlights the series. Okay. The other series that I want to speak to real quick is Sense8. And specifically, Sense8 follows a number of individuals across the world. It was directed by the Wachowski sisters. If you know what, they were the ones that directed The Matrix, which I think is coming. There's a new one coming out soon. And Sense8 focuses on just that, these 8 individuals who are, I wouldn't say psychically connected, but they're connected. They are able to access each other's sort of knowledge, skills, and feelings and experiences, but also sometimes they can literally transcend and visit each other across the world. And so you end up having these 8 characters in different places and spaces. And it's sort of a sci-fi series. It aired for 2 seasons. It was canceled. And because there was such a huge audience that demanded it come back, they ended up having a 2-hour finale, a movie finale. And so that's also the power of audiences sometimes, to think about how, while the series was just very popular, and but it was canceled because of, I guess, it's probably more expensive than I think one of the reasons was it was shot in around the world. It was more expensive than Game of Thrones to be shot. That was why it was canceled. But audiences definitely wanted an ending to the series, wanted a sort of a wrap up. But one of the things that I love about Sense8 is that in many ways it is queering identities and relationships. And what I mean is that when you look at the different characters, there are just a wide diversity of romantic relationships going on in the series. And so, for example, you end up having Nomi and Amita, who are an interracial transgender lesbian relationship. You have Lito, Hernando, and Daniela. Daniela ends up sort of being, I call it the non-normative threesome, because Lito and Hernando are two gay men in their relationship, but they sort of allow her to be the third partner. And then finally, Kalia, Wolfgang, and Rajan. It's interesting, they take the trope of the love triangle. Who will she choose? Will it be Wolfgang or Rajan? And not to spoil it, she doesn't have to decide. The series ends up having it be accepted that they can be in a polyamorous relationship. And so I think here what we have is not just queer characters, but also looking at this queering of romantic relationships. The other thing, it was probably considered one of the sexiest series on Netflix. And one of the things that was talked about was in both season 1 and 2, there is a polysexual orgy that occurs. So you have these very, very attractive very attractive people who end up having these sort of orgies that occur, but in many ways, it's not so much that the orgies are just orgies, but rather it's rethinking how we relate to others. And so it ends up being a way to how they end up sort of connecting, not just sexually, but also psychically and physically. And so one of the analysis I did was looking at how the song that's going on during the cluster orgy, I guess you could say, is played. And if you look at the lyrics to the song, you can see how this in some ways is trying to resist what we think about in terms of monogamous relationships. So the lyrics say, "Everyone is freaks and harries, dykes and fairies. Tell me where is sanity? I'd love to, but I don't know what to do, so I'll leave it up to you." And so the lyrics sort of reinforce the transformative energy of sex and sexuality is not just sort of one person or two people, but many people. And so perhaps it's a way of thinking differently, of possibilities. Or you could just watch the series and be like, there are really sexy people having an orgy. Okay. So what should we think about in terms of the future of queer pop culture? Well, we continue to have controversies. I don't know how many of you have gone to see Eternals just came out in the movie theater. Eternals was banned in China as well as several other countries because there is a gay character and has a same-sex kiss with his husband. And there's also been controversy. The new DC Comics Superman was announced as a bisexual character. And so you continue to have these controversies, resistance. A lot of times folks are talking about how somehow, these are characters and we don't need to have any type of sexuality or any type of sort of what will sort of the rhetoric sometimes is what will the children think, how will we protect the children, okay? But I think what we're seeing again is that we continue to have queer pop culture is on the rise and is being in many ways marginalized, or not marginalized, but sort of put into the forefront. The last thing I want to say, because I want to just wrap up here and have time for questions, is not just, again, centering characters, but centering stories. And I want to show a clip here. Sort of SNL got kind of funny with this, but lately we've had the rise of what's known as lesbian period dramas in film. And SNL sort of did a skit here that I thought was funny, and thinking about and sort of making fun of these lesbian period dramas and sort of the patterns of or sort of things that are going on in the lesbian period drama. So I want to show a clip of that, and then end with talking a little bit about Disclosure, the documentary. Okay. So I don't know if it was, I find it hilarious, but again, sort of thinking about centering queer stories, and clearly there seems to be an increase of lesbian period dramas for SNL to sort of play on that. The final thing I wanted to say is that I see the future of pop culture increasing in terms of representation of gender queer characters and transgender identities. And I think a really great documentary for anyone is the Netflix documentary Disclosure, which focuses on just that, is looking at the history of trans individuals in television and film, and also perhaps where that will go. So, but I am going to wrap it up because I would love to hear from you. I've been talking now for about 50 minutes and would love to get a discussion going. And so I really appreciate your time and consideration, but man, I want to hear from all of you. So please feel free to ask me questions and let's have a dialogue. Thank you.
Clapping, you can hear.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Young, for that presentation. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Kristen LaFollette. I'm an assistant professor in the English department, but I'm going to be facilitating our question and answer this afternoon. So I did see that we had one question come in. Someone was curious about, so we see more queer representation since the 90s, and they're kind of wondering maybe what happened from the 90s to the present that led to the trend of us seeing more queer representation in the media?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, so one of the things about pop culture is how it's both a reflection of the cultural shifts, right, that are going on in larger society, as well as also, it's not just a reflection, but also can be a way of making those shifts as well. And so what we see is, I think, a cultural shift over time of just more acceptance. And so what you end up having are, even before sort of, one of the big sort of moments, I think, was when Ellen came out on her series. And that's one of those big moments in television. But you start to see more of that partly because I think there's greater acceptance. I think you end up having more television. I also think that you end up having, cultural shifts and attitudes about LGBTQ individuals change over time. And so it's reflected in media, as well as media sort of potentially making those changes as well. As I said, like the greater visibility sometimes can help people to have attitudes change about particular groups of people they may have not have been exposed to or may interact on a daily basis. And so there were a lot of changes. Gosh, I mean, we can talk about the history, but the 80s was really sort of a focus on the HIV/AIDS epidemic, right? And then sort of, I would say you start to have things like Don't Ask, Don't Tell in the 90s and 2000s. You end up having a push of activism for marriage equality and same-sex marriage, right? You end up having a lot of these sort of cultural shifts, I think, that ultimately are reflected in media.
And so that actually leads well into our next question. Someone was curious about what you think about the USI community, and if you think our university community is, or maybe like a better way to frame this is, how can we bring more awareness to the USI community to create a more inclusive and accepting space on campus?
Sure. I think one thing is having lectures like this. I think, right, opportunities for dialogue are really important. Recognizing that we have faculty across the university who do this type of research, who do things, right, related to different minority groups. So it doesn't necessarily have to be, right, LGBTQ. But I think that's one thing that's really important, is recognizing that our faculty can be resources, especially for our students who may not even realize that this is some of the stuff that we do. I think another thing are some of the small things. So for example, I know a lot of us over in liberal arts, we include sort of pronouns, right? And having small little things like adding pronouns and recognizing our students, right, pronouns. I'm also thinking things like, for example, questioning sort of, I just had a lecture on talking about transgender rights and talking about like, where are, for example, gender neutral bathrooms on campus, right? How is that, right? That small little thing can potentially communicate to students and faculty and staff, right, that we are much more inclusive. And so there's these little things, I think, that are really important for us to address, that are really significant, right? As simple as including examples in our lectures where you end up having, a same-sex couple, right? I think those little things do matter. So I think that's sort of the first step, is sort of reflecting on what are the practices that we have here at USI and what we can do to better that.
Yeah, absolutely. When I did my queer studies lecture back in September, someone asked a similar question and I touched on some of those same things that I get questions from students about those things too, like where are the gender neutral restrooms on campus and those kinds of things. So I think it's good to talk about that. Dr. Lynn, did you have any questions? Do we have any more?
I always have questions.
Yeah.
I always have questions. So I actually, going back to the start of your talk, when you were talking about terminology, which is always great, because I know like I feel sometimes lost as well. But there was some pushback recently about using queer for an older generation of people who grew up with queer as an epithet, right? Like as something that was hurled at them as a slur. And so have you seen this kind of same thing, this resistance to using that phrase? And or I don't know, maybe like how you would address that trepidation of older generations of people who don't like the word.
Yeah, I think it's, so as a communication scholar, one of the things that I'm fascinated with is the I don't want to say evolution of language, but how language shifts and changes over time, right? So for example, I talk to my students and I say, look, when I was in college, right, is the first time I even heard of some of these terms. And that for me, what resonated for me was when I came out was I identify as bisexual, right? And so now for many younger people, they see that term almost as outdated, right? That they're saying, look, what about pansexuality, right? Like, so there's always, I think, language that's evolving, that's changing, that's shifting. But the words should resonate with the individual in many ways, right? That says, look, if this is a word or term that allows me to be able to communicate my identity, to be able to express, right, who I am, then that's extremely important. I will say absolutely that the term queer, right, comes from a very negative place, but it's also the sort of what I would call reclaiming the term. I see more and more of the usage of term queer as a way to reclaim and empower individuals by saying, look, that this was something that was a derogatory term used to attack, to bully, to right, and now we're taking it back. And that can be a really powerful tool in sort of engaging in terms of empowering oneself. But if you don't use the term, right, that's okay too, right? I think what it is having those discussions about language and how language can change over time. I keep learning new terminology for my students, right? Again, like gender fluid, right? Like these are terms that, gender queer, like language continues to evolve. And I think that's important that we have these discussions about, again, where the terminology comes from, but also how it can be used in powerful ways today.
Thank you.
Yes. So yes, thank you for that, because I have students ask me those questions a lot too. Like I heard that this term was not acceptable, but I hear people still using it. And it's just a recognition of the way that language changes over time. Good way to segue into lessons about that, I think, in my classes at least. Okay, so this is a question that I didn't even think of, but I love this. And I'm interested to hear what you have to say about this. But someone asked, what do you think about heterosexual actors playing queer characters? They said, let's see, on social media, a lot of queer people have an issue with it, whereas others think it's acceptable because regardless, queer people and queer stories are being represented. And they said, as a queer person, I do feel slightly bothered that queer actors are not always used for queer roles. So what do you think about that?
I think it's a tough one. I think that what we need are more stories that are queer-centric, that allow for possibilities for more, right, for more LGBTQ actors to play those roles. I think that you're absolutely right. I think that, but I think it's also a challenge because there are times where you end up having, right, the director chooses an actor based upon their celebrity status, and so they not necessarily might not identify as queer, but I think what we need is trying to find more, not just characters that are queer and actors who are queer occupying those spaces, but I think we need more writers and directors and filmmakers and television producers who are. I think that's also extremely important. It's not just who's on the screen, but also who's writing those stories. And even with the SNL skit, right? They mentioned like, oh, clearly they joked, right? The sex scene, and they said, clearly this is a man who's directing, right? Because in fact, reinforces that hypersexuality. And so I think one of the things is not just looking at representation in terms of these characters and who's performing those characters, but also we need to just expand the stories. We need more. And when you have more, then there are more opportunities for folks to you know, tell those stories.
Yeah, it's been something that I have started doing recently. Whenever I'm watching a show or a film where there is a queer character, I always want to know, like, is there representation here of an actual queer actor or actress? Like, how are they going about doing that in this? But yes, well, I hear about that a lot, and I think it's an interesting conversation to have, because it is nice to have the representation, but you also want the real people behind the film and the show to be represented as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so someone else asked, do you believe people will get used to more queer representation? They're thinking specifically about the movie Eternals, and that apparently it was rated not, I haven't actually seen the ratings for this, but apparently it was rated as the worst Marvel movie. Do you think it is possible having a gay character has something to do with the low reviews that it got?
So I went and saw it, and I would say no. I mean, I think, and this is my critique of the film, and I apologize for folks who haven't seen the film. I think they tried to do too much in a film format. I think there was such a wide diversity of characters. You need it to almost be a television series where you could focus on each character more. So for me, it wasn't so much you end up having the negative reviews be associated with the queer character, but rather they try to do too much in too little of time. But I do love that you end up having, for example, the first Marvel character, superhero who's deaf, right? I mean, there's clearly a wide diversity of representation in the film, but the story perhaps isn't tight enough. And I think that's what sort of happened with the poor reviews. Yeah, but that's my interpretation.
Good to know. I'm interested in seeing that, but I had not seen the reviews yet. I look at Rotten Tomatoes too much, and it impacts me.
I do too. I do too. I also think the film, again, this is sort of sidetrack here, but I think the film didn't have to be connected to the Marvel universe. Like for me, it was almost, they're trying to do too much again, or and it would have probably been a better, and that's the different format between television and film. Yeah. Right? Television allows for going more in depth because it's over time. So instead of 2 hours, you have 20 episodes, or how many episodes you want, right? And so I think that also is trying to compress everything into one film. Might perhaps the format, the medium itself, might have been a disservice to the storytelling.
Right. That makes sense. Okay, let's see. What got you interested in this area of research, and how do you think society will change along with media becoming more accepting?
Ooh, so besides the fact that I love watching TV, I guess it wasn't until really grad school that I realized that I could do this as research. So my background actually is in rhetorical studies. So traditionally, rhetoric and rhetorical criticism focuses on public speaking and speeches. But then looking at how texts, right? And text can be a number of things, but like how a film or a book or a television series, right, can be analyzed. And so I was constantly trying to unpack what are the messages being, what are my interpretations or messages being communicated in TV. So I think I sort of stumbled across pop culture, but I've always enjoyed watching television and pop culture. What was the second question?
I think you kind of already addressed it in that earlier question, but they had asked, like, how do you think that society, I guess maybe what they're getting at is, do you see society changing as media is becoming more inclusive and accepting?
I think so too. I think also we have a multiplicity of platforms. So for example, streaming services have played a huge role in expanding audiences. I mean, if you go onto any platform, you can also see how algorithms allow you to sort of segment into genres. So you can go and look at LGBTQ, right, sort of genre, and then there'll be suggestions there. I also see, things like Facebook Live and TikTok, which allow for just about anyone to generate and create, right, videos that can, right, present particular stories or characters or even comment associated with cultural issues. And so I think that's also interesting. Traditionally, we've had sort of the top down of these are the media producers, and now people are sort of in also producing their own media. And so I think the more you have it, the more you end up having folks having dialogue associated with queer media and queer pop culture.
Yes, thank you. So I think in the interest of time, maybe we'll wrap up with this last question here. So, okay, this person is thinking about, because you talked a bit about how gay characters, there's sometimes the trope that gay characters are presented as scheming or sinister. And so they were wondering whether or not that representation has anything to do with the fact that historically people who identified as LGBTQ have had to hide their identity because of the impact that society would have if they knew the truth about that identity.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think what it is again, pop culture and tropes are reflecting of larger societal norms. And so what you end up seeing, right, is that if you end up having homophobic stereotypes such as, you know, gay men are sexual predators, right, or right, any of those sort of horrible stereotypes, you know, homosexuality is a sin, right? You have all of these sort of negative things. The tropes are going to reflect those stereotypes. And so I think one of the things is that absolutely, you also probably, as the person had said, sort of the fact that, you know, you end up having oftentimes queer individuals, because of their stigmatized identity, not coming out, or right, not having to be secretive of their particular sexual orientation or gender identity, that also plays a role in sort of the idea of the scheming villain, right, of being secretive or non-trusting. But absolutely, those tropes are going to reflect larger societal norms that are often homophobic, transphobic, right, and stereotypical.
And I said that was the last one, but there's one more that I think it would be really interesting to hear your response to. So I will ask this really quick. But this person was interested in if you have researched queer representation in stories and characters in films and shows from other countries. And if so, how has that differed from the work you've done with shows and films within the US?
I have not. And that is one of those areas where I really, that you're showing off, right? You're telling me like, have you done that? And I was like, it's on the list of things to do. But yes, I would love to look at more global media. One of the things that I tell folks is not only do I do sort of queer pop culture, but I'm also very interested associated with, again, with not just gender and sexuality, but also racial issues. And so representation of, for example, Asian American women in media. And so what I really am interested in eventually doing on the list of things that I want to do is looking at queer identities in Korean K-dramas. I think that to me would be interesting because, you know, sort of recently, right, Squid Game was a huge, you know, success globally. So Korean dramas and Korean pop culture, I think, has just become a global phenomenon. And so I'd be really interested in doing more of sort of looking at queer representation in K-dramas and Korean pop culture. So that is on the list of things to do.
That would be awesome because there's so much good content coming out of South Korea right now. And I myself have been watching a lot of them, but I want to say thank you to Dr. Young for taking time out of her very busy schedule to share some of her research. And I want to encourage students that, you know, if you want to know more, because a lot of you had some really great questions, there are two professors right here, right in front of you, who teach fantastic classes on campus who could teach you some of these things we've been talking about all semester. So Introduction to Queer Studies with Dr. LaFollette, and Dr. Young teaches in communications. So LGBT rhetorics, I know, is a class for upper level communications majors, but we have it in the gender studies minor. It'll certainly be in any future classes for queer studies that we hope to have. So if you have more questions, I would encourage you to talk to Dr. Young and Dr. LaFollette because we are lucky to have them on campus with us. So thank you everyone for coming, and thank you for everyone who's been attending our lectures this semester. I think it's been a lot of fun. And we will certainly continue these someday. Just, give us a chance to plan them again. So thank you everyone for coming. This has been really fantastic. Thank you both for teaching us so much, teaching me so much too. And thank you to Carolyn for being our backdoor person on Zoom for every single one of our queer studies talks. So thank you all for coming, and enjoy the rest of your week and the rest of your semester. So
Thank you so much.